Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour. I am happy to be back in Pristina to examine important global and local developments that affect the lives of all Kosovars. And today I will be discussing important questions with our special guest on the Bugajski hot seat, Albin Kurti, leader of the election winner, the Vetëvendosja movement. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled, "The European Union Blocks the Balkans." European Union failure to launch accession talks with Albania and North Macedonia at its October summit will contribute to destabilizing the region. Blocked entry will send a message of abandonment precisely when these countries need more intense UE involvement. Albania and North Macedonia were blocked despite support from the European Commission and the European Parliament. A positive decision on accession talks would not have signified imminent membership, but the start of a long process of qualification. French President Emmanuel Macron led the blocking policy and was joined by Denmark and Holland. Macron claimed that the accession process had to be reformed, signifying that the October decision is unlikely to be reversed anytime soon, because EU reforms can drag on for years. France's internal politics and fears of mass immigration figured in Macron's decision. Some analysts suspect that Islamophobia and anti-Albanian sentiments also played a role. The blocking policy can have many negative repercussions. It damages EU credibility, disillusions citizens, and undermines domestic reform programs. It can reinforce political polarization and encourage nationalists to claim that the EU rules no longer apply and each state must pursue its own national interests. This may also discourage interstate agreements and undercut the efforts of the two US special envoys to resolve the dispute between Serbia and Kosovo. Belgrade will now have less incentive to make compromises without a clearer prospect of EU entry. Serbia and Montenegro have started accession talks, but will conclude that without EU consensus on enlargement, the talks will lead into a cul-de-sac. The most immediately affected country is North Macedonia. Prime Minister Zoran Zaev took substantial political risks in changing the country's name to settle the dispute with Greece and fulfill EU conditions for accession talks. The government now feels betrayed and has called for early elections in April 2020 that may actually invigorate militants and opponents of the name change. A negative decision on Balkan accession talks and further enlargement will rebound negatively on the security of the European Union itself. The population outflow into the EU will continue if membership prospects recede, reforms are stalled, and unemployment rises. And the European Union will be in a weaker position to resolve disputes if it is seen as surrendering its main leverage, the incentive of membership. This will ensure that the United States' role in the region becomes even more critical. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with Albin Kurti, leader of the recent general election winner, the Vetëvendosja movement. Thank you for joining me on the show, Albin. It's good to have you.
Thank you for having me again.
It's a very important time, and of course, belated congratulations on the election victory.
Thank you.
We were watching very closely in America, and I think there was surprise, but I think happy surprise for a lot of people. Let me start with a very basic question about the formation of the next government. I know it takes time, there's always a process involved. Will the new government simply be a coalition between Vetëvendosja and LDK, or do you envisage a broader coalition?
First step is the most important step, and that is agreement between Vetëvendosja and LDK. Once we have this in place, we might think to expand. But the core of future coalition government for sure will be Vetëvendosja and LDK. What I've been doing in recent days is that to include non-Serb minorities as well, because they have 10 guaranteed seats, and we want them to be within our government and to serve all their communities. Likewise, we do not want to exclude Serbs, but we do not want our government to be dependent from Serb minority as it has been in the past. And we envisage that having a Serb minister in our government is a constitutional obligation, yet not a political necessity. So Vetvendosi and LDK is the core, and we shall see later on. For the time being, we have harmonized our programs in quite certain fields of our future joint government, like economy, education, healthcare. All these are topics that we are discussing. And on the other hand, we want to aim at 12 ministries only, which is not easy, but I think it's doable. And 2 deputy ministers per ministry, 2 deputy prime ministers max, and 30% women at least.
So streamlining the government, basically. Would that involve also civil servants, bureaucracy? Would they be streamlined as well?
There is this administrative reform that we have agreed upon to implement in our public administration and a corpus of civil servants, where we want professionalization and departization. However, our approach is not going to be to sack people from their jobs, but rather to give them tasks so they work. Finally, they work, because many people have working places without working much there. So our approach is actually to employ them while they are not unemployed.
Right.
So this is our approach. But then, if there will be overemployment in certain sectors, we plan to transfer them to other sectors for which we might need additional trainings. For example, labor inspectorate, inspectorate of environment, construction, market, healthcare, and so on.
Right. I wanted just one more word about the Serbian participation in the government. Do you envisage somebody from the Serbian list? I mean, Serbian list seems to have a sort of stranglehold, a monopoly over the Serbian vote. Or do you intend to include somebody from outside the Serbian list?
My problem with a political party called Serbian list was never that it is Serbian, but because it is not a party. It was always an instrument of Belgrade. I'm sorry to say this, but the pressure on Serbs of Kosovo was actually the pressure of Belgrade on Serbian list. They served as interface to transfer this pressure to people. And it resulted in massive fraud, in enormous amount of irregularities and law violations on 6th of October and during the campaign, for that matter. 2 of my colleagues from the parliament, Nenad Rašić and Slobodan Petrović, they've told me that there are cases where one Serbian citizen in the north voted 18 times. And there are villages in Viti and in Klina and also Budriga in Ana Morava region where you have more votes for Serbian list than Serbian inhabitants before the war in these places. So I really think we should do something about this. Massive fraud in June 2017, massive fraud in October 2019, in between assassination of Oliver Ivanovic, this negative chain, which is around hands of Serbian citizens of Kosovo, turning Serb majority municipalities in Kosovo having less democracy than even in China, I think has to end.
Well, I hope the OSCE and other international organizations are looking into this and checking and monitoring the situation.
I think they know better than me what has been going on in October in Serb majority municipalities, and together Kosovo institutions and international partners should really address this issue. And we liberated Kosovo from Belgrade. The time has come to liberate also Serbs of Kosovo from Belgrade.
Let's focus now on domestic economic questions. Your priorities, you stated, would be jobs and justice. Yes. Domestically. So let's start with jobs, in other words, the economy. How would you stimulate, in a sort of bigger max picture, how will you stimulate employment and economic growth? What are your main sort of criteria or framework of work?
Our small and medium enterprises, they emphasize three main problems. One is corruption of the institutions, meaning that certain businessmen are privileged by public procurement. Mm-hmm. This has to end. And second is poverty of population, meaning low purchasing power, so low aggregate demand. And third is difficult access to finances. Mm. Kosovo's gap, economic gap, consists of, on one hand, cheap capital of diaspora, and on the other hand, expensive capital of banks. So we plan to start with a development bank, which would lower interest rates and increase grace periods, so our small and medium enterprises can flourish. So I want to help private sector. We cannot employ all people in state offices. So we need to help private sector, especially manufacture, but also trade, services, and finances, because out of 170,000 small and medium enterprises that we have in Kosovo, over 90% of them have less than 10 employees. So we have oligarchs on one hand and micro enterprises on the other. Mm-hmm. This is another gap in the structure of our economy. Between, yes. Yeah. And third gap, which also worries me a lot, is the fact that 2/3 of our budget revenues is collected at the border. Value-added tax, excise duty, and custom duty, mm-hmm, together is 2/3 of budget revenues. And 5 times more in budget revenues is done by indirect taxes than by direct ones, whereas income tax, property tax, and corporate tax. So, time-wise, Janusz, the structure of our economy is the one of medieval times, when you collect of pre-industrial era, mm-hmm, when you collect your budget at the border. This is medieval times. Mm-hmm. It's pre-industrialization, pre-industrial revolution. Place-wise, space-wise, the structure of our economy is the one of Middle East countries who are rich in oil, with an exception that we are not rich in oil.
Except you don't have to.
So we have remittances.
Yeah.
So we have remittances of our diaspora, which are over 1 billion euros. So we have to change the structure of our economy. And I think that we should do this, in one hand, by addressing these three issues: difficult access to finances, poverty among population, and corruption in the institutions. But on the other hand, we need to link education with economy. Labor market must be linked with qualitative education. And dual German-Swiss education model is the right way to go. So students and pupils to spend, let's say, 3 to 4 days per week in schools and in faculties, 1 to 2 days per week in factories where they will be working apprentice and so on. Mm-hmm. So professional schools, vocational colleges, or in Austria, for example, 2/3 of high schools are professional ones, only 1/3 are gymnasiums. So I think that to bridge skills gap, we need this link between education and mm-hmm, labor market.
Going back to the state role in the economy, you've talked a lot about the privatization program that favored specific people, was not fair to Kosovo, sometimes with foreign buyouts of particular industries and so forth. How do you see the future of the privatization agency? Is it something that needs to be reformed or needs to be replaced?
I think the mandate of privatization agency of Kosovo should be terminated. They are spending for operative costs the privatization fund. This is insane. So what we need is to take over socially owned enterprises from Privatization Agency of Kosovo, restructure them, and with a stakeholders approach to sell shares instead of privatize or liquidate them. And I think we can bring capital of our diaspora into publicly owned enterprises and socially owned enterprises. So we do not want to nationalize them. No, far from that. But we want to have an investment sovereign fund similar to Sovereign Holding of Slovenia or to Treasury Ministry of Poland, where this investment sovereign fund would be the key stakeholder in all these industries, but not the only one. And bit by bit, we would sell shares to banks, to our diaspora, and also to our pensionist trust funds. And in this way, to make more dynamic publicly owned enterprises and socially owned enterprises into changing their character with this stakeholder, shareholder approach. On the other hand, it is important to put first layer for foreign direct investment through our diaspora, who are ready to come here. And according to one survey, they do not care much about profit as much as safety of their investment. So they just don't want to lose. Sure. Albanians are very patriotic people. They come at least once per year to Kosovo. And they would like to invest, but they want to make sure that their investment is not going to be surrounded with bribes and corruption and with different kind of court processes which never end.
How big do you envisage the state sector to be? I mean, ideally in the future, in Kosovo's future, for the sake of economic development, how large a state sector, how large a private sector?
At present, every salary in public sector is over 500 euros, and in private sector is only 350 euros. So we have to increase private sector. So the average salary in private sector is around 600 euros. And in this way, we are going to stop migration of youth, which is really harming us as state and future of the people likewise. So I want to help private sector boost, bearing in mind that for certain industries and certain branches, even if state is not a good manager, it is not a bad owner. So certain things, because we have a weak state, if we bring in some very powerful private corporation, which is even more powerful than the state itself, then you can have tensions and conflicts. So for the time being, don't put state as a manager, but as an owner, help private sector boost and bring private capital of our diaspora and foreign investments as well.
You don't sound like a socialist.
Well, I'm a social democrat. So I think that for liberalization of the market, you do not need to get rid of publicly owned enterprises. You don't need to get rid of public sector, but public enterprises and private enterprises can compete in the market.
Basically, you're talking about a program that would boost the economy, to start a takeoff in a way of economic growth in this economy.
Yes.
Whatever it takes. The state always has to play some sort of role in this.
Yeah, 5 times more is in budget revenues is indirect taxes comparing to direct taxes. This has to change. 5 times higher. So 3 times higher is only VAT at the border comparing to entirely direct taxes, corporate tax, income tax, and property tax. Only VAT is 3 times higher than all these 3 combined together. This structure of economy cannot continue like this. Remittances from our diaspora is keeping us alive. That's our oil. But you know, when in Middle East countries, you have to drill to get oil. Here, we don't have even to do that because it is them who bring this money and we just spend it in the imports. which are part of an enormous trade deficit amounting to 40% of our GDP and much bigger than the budget of the state. So I'm really optimistic that together with LDK, we're going to change the structure of our economy.
In terms of foreign investment, in addition to diaspora bringing in money, are there particular sectors of the economy where you think foreign direct investment can play a role, a stimulating role?
I think we can bring them into several branches of our economy. We have telecommunication, energy, mines and minerals, then IT sector, agriculture, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But we are going to be careful to give advantage to our diaspora and then to corporations who come from the countries that helped us most, mm-hmm. and from the countries who recognized our independence, because we live in difficult times when economy and geopolitics are not independent from each other. So we must be careful in this aspect as well. And also when it comes to shares, you don't need to really give a chunk of 60% to somebody. Mm-hmm. So you can diversify investments in our social and publicly owned enterprises, which will be part of a joint investment sovereign fund.
Two areas that you mentioned, I think, are very important: healthcare and education. Can you explain to us a little bit more on how you intend to improve both these systems?
It is important to bring best students of our universities back into education system, especially by refreshing high school. Our high school is quite weak. Mm-hmm. In order to have good students in university, you must first, best students, once they graduate and get their diplomas, to come back to the system, especially in high school. This is one of the things. Second is that we should rewrite curriculums. They are not well done, and many of them should be translated. Mm. So we don't have to invent the wheel or the warm water, as we say in Albanian, like you just combine the hot and the cold one, you get the warm. So it's like, it's not a rocket science thing. Mm-hmm. It's much better to translate and to have right curriculums. Then we must create elementary conditions for our pupils. There are schools in Kosovo when there's no soap. And we need some trainings for teachers, because some of the methods they use are quite outdated. And we need to restore the authority of teacher in our education system. So this means that we have to invest in teacher, mm-hmm. not only in the salary of the teacher, but also in the method of teaching of the teacher.
The skills, yeah.
And regarding healthcare, we simply should make sure that the list of essential medicines are in place, and not like nowadays when you go to hospital and you have to pay for all the medicines you get there, mm-hmm. and when they lack elementary material to treat you. And for example, nowadays the pharmaceutics which are needed for treatment in hospital are 30% more expensive if they are close to main hospital comparing to the one at the center of the town. So these kind of things are really, really unacceptable and will not be tolerated anymore. Mm-hmm. So doctors also, I think, should be choosing whether they want to work in private sector or public sector, because it's not fair to use public institutions to recruit patients for afternoon treatment in private ambulances that these doctors have created. So I think they will have to choose.
You bring us on to the second most important part, jobs and justice. Let's focus on the justice, particularly on the corruption question. You stated that the judiciary is captured by the state, probably more precisely being captured by specific political interests within the state. How do you plan to make the judiciary independent of political interests? This is a struggle that a lot of countries face in the region.
Yeah. First of all, we are going to lift the pressure of executive branch on judiciary, and prosecution. We're going to do vetting process for security sector and for justice sector. So not only for prosecutors and judges, but also for intelligence and police. But I think not for all of them, only for the leading positions for high-ranking officials. We also plan to lead by example. We need a couple of prosecutors who become very famous in Kosovo.
Elliot Ness.
And I think that it's important to have a prosecutor in Kosovo who is more famous than Prime Minister. Then I will consider that as new Prime Minister, I've done my job by turning a new prosecutor into a person who is more famous than me. And we also need to change the procedural code because for one prosecutor to reach its high position, you need to spend 10 years in the system. What if, for example, we have a Kosovar prosecutor who works in Western Europe or in United States and wants to come back and help us? Should she or he spend 10 years now in our system? Of course not. So we have to enable them to reach appropriate, adequate positions and levels within our system much faster. And we have to standardize in courts all the verdicts and the sentences, because there are so many cases when, for example, for tax evasion, one judge for the same amount in the same branch, one judge sentenced you with a fine, the other judge with imprisonment, and the other one with probation. So it's the same. So
for the same crime.
For the same crime. So it's not okay that citizens of Kosovo feel that they are at the mercy of subjectivity and arbitrariness of a personal judge with a specific name who is taking their case. There must be standards and criteria put in place, and the model of Estonia with digitalization of the entire judiciary, I think, is the right way forward.
Yeah, Estonia is a model for a lot of things,
yes,
including particularly anti-corruption.
Yes, but when it comes to anti-corruption, Janos, I think that our approach will be as follows. Corruption does not come from weakness of the citizens, but from powerlessness of certain politicians. Corruption does not come from below, it comes from above. And there has been one survey which concluded that in Montenegro, 34% of families pay bribes so they get public services which are supposed to be guaranteed by the state. In Kosovo, it's only 10%. In Kosovo, it's more hopeful. Democracy's potential is better in Kosovo than anywhere else in the region. That's why in Kosovo, opposition can win, because there's no trickle-down effect. There is huge corruption, but quite concentrated at the top. So corruption in Kosovo is a system rather than culture. That's why we could win, unlike in some other neighboring countries where opposition has no chance.
Yeah, in other words, there isn't this sort of let's say expectation that everybody's going to take a bribe in order to do a service that they should be doing in any case.
Yes, exactly.
Which is throughout the post-communist world. But you're saying in Kosovo it's lower.
Kosovo is better.
Huh, interesting. What about some of the privatization questions? Are you going to look into some of the sales of particular companies and state enterprises?
We have to, and we have to reverse where it is possible, but also where the cost doesn't exceed the benefits. Because certain privatization, you simply cannot dig there anymore because it will cost too much. So we are going to treat all the cases where there has been law violations, human rights violations, constitutional violations, procedural violations. But again, I hope that there will be more cases where the benefit will be higher than the costs that we will have to pay.
Presumably one of the things you have to be, let's say, aware of is this notion of political revenge, not to be seen as conducting an anti-corruption campaign simply in order to, let's say, beat your former political opponent.
Of course, I think one of the reasons why we did have revenge is precisely because there was no justice. Once you have justice in place, there is less need for revenge in general. Because without judiciary, you end up into this Shakespearean model where, like in Shakespeare dramas, the only possible justice is revenge. And I think these are extreme situations. And we shall build our system in place with social concern, with not only court justice, but social justice as well, so people don't get frustrated and indignated and think that revenge is the only justice possible. For example, we are going to build new apartments, 4,000 apartments for young couples. With our scheme, 150 multiplied with 150, meaning 150 euros max mortgage per 150 months of payment. Because, you know, etymology of word mortgage is mort from death. It's death pledge.
Right.
So it's not to pay till you die.
It's a life pledge.
Yes, not to pay till you die, but the debt will die within 12.5 years. So we want really people to stay in Kosovo, not to migrate, not to leave our beautiful country for which we suffered so much. And these new apartments within this scheme of social affordable housing are also one of our measures that we want to bring optimism in place with concrete measures.
You must expect some support from the US. I mean, America's been campaigning throughout the region for anti-corruption drives, not just this region, but throughout the post-communist world. One would think that after campaigning for so long, they would back you in this anti-corruption drive. Are you beginning to see that, or do you expect that?
Yes, I expect that, and I'm looking forward to that. United States are international factor which cannot be replaced by anyone else for Kosovo and Albanians in general. And I look very much forward to cooperate with US Embassy, with US institutions in Kosovo and elsewhere, in order that this anti-corruption campaign, rule of law, state of justice we bring in place. And finally, we close this chapter of liberation and independence, which had to do very much with our existence and dignity, into development one. We need development. And for this, we need to have a democratic state building with anti-corruption and proper rule of law, and US leads by example. US courts are famous, not just because of Hollywood movies, but because people know very well that whatever happens in politics in the United States or in diplomatic world inside and outside of the United States, US courts are something supreme. So in every court in US, justice is supreme, not only in Supreme Court.
Right. In addition to Elliot Ness, I hope you have untouchables here as well.
Yes.
So you don't have to import them from Chicago.
Yes, we do have them here.
Let me ask you one other question on the domestic side, which I think is important, and that's police reform. Do you envisage reform in the police structure?
Yes, there is needed new structures of our police and new people in these structures, and especially more trainings and capacities. And I think that our police is one of the very well respected institutions. They are quite trained when it comes to protest and demonstrations, also thanks to us. So we've done some live training for them, but I think they should be more trained in combating organized crime and corruption, and that is what I look forward to cooperate with them.
Okay. Let me go on to, because we have still quite a bit of ground to cover. I'm not sure how much time we have, but let's look again at the Serbian question within Kosovo. You mentioned, and I think it is very important, the importance of dialogue with the population here, rather than just seeing this population through the prism of Belgrade, which I think has been the case with the let's say bilateral talks between Pristina and Belgrade. Can you explain what you have in mind to better integrate the population in the economic, political, social structure of Kosovo?
In Kosovo, we have nowadays around 130,000 Serbs. Over 2/3 of them, they live in south of Iber, Kosovo. But in addition to this, one moment in time which made me aware that perhaps we have been neglecting so much the issue of local Serbs. has a particular date, 23rd of December 2015. Constitutional Court ruling saying that Association of Serb Majority Municipalities is anti-constitutional. Next day, no protest from Serbs of Kosovo. So they didn't really want it. It was Belgrade, but they are just afraid. And I think that we as majority, as Albanians, and we as State of Kosovo, as next government, have responsibility to protect Serbs so they get rid of this fear that they have from Belgrade. The very fact that 100% of votes have to be won by Serbian lists is preposterous. You know, even dictators, they want between 18 and 90%.
Yeah, sometimes they get greedy.
So between 80 and 90.
Right.
But overdoing with 100% of votes for a Serbian list, or 99%, this overdoing, this was not even in communist era. So why are they doing this? I think that they are doing this because in one hand, authoritarians, they become irrational. On the other hand, they feel their own fragility. So they overdo, they overstretch their virtual support, precisely due to lack of self-confidence. Because when you have self-confidence, you don't want to win 100%. And I think in places where you see imminent danger and mean things happening, the other side is a great opportunity as well. So I look forward that with dialogue with Serbs of Kosovo, internal dialogue, to encourage them, to unite them, to bring them together so they can address their concerns and get organized and fight for their rights. I think that they can cooperate easily with Albanians when it comes to development, for example. If you have Albanians and Serbs in different schools, they can go in the same factory. They can work together. If language is different, the language of machines in manufacture is not different, it's the same. It's the language of machines, which is neither Serb nor Albanian. And probably manual is in English and the machine is coming from Germany. But nonetheless, this is the place where we see that we can really build so many bridges. Oliver Ivanović was not assassinated just because he was not listening to Belgrade. I found out recently something interesting, that a few days earlier, they were preparing and perhaps even held a meeting of different Serb organizations in Kosovo and political parties for autonomous, authentic voice of Serbs of Kosovo. And then he was hit. Of course, he was part of the structures of Serbia during the war and after the war, a very notorious man. But in one point in time, he decided not just to be independent, but also to unite all others. And I remember in the 80s and in the 90s, many Albanian activists were assassinated by Serbian Secret Service precisely when they tried to unite different organizations. I will mention just two cases. Yusuf and Bardosh Grvola and Kadri Zeka in 1982, and Meh Uka in 1996. So precisely at the moment when they were about to succeed in uniting different fractions or organizations, Serbia hits hard there. So I think, and it's so sad that our police and our prosecutors and our state mechanism did not do much, because it has nothing to do with Oliver Ivanović per se. It has to do with the entire political context which was destroyed and whose consequences we're living today.
It's a bit of a unique situation what you describe. In other words, that a foreign government has so much, let's say, control over a minority, kindred minority population in a neighboring state. I could imagine if Albania tried to exert that much control over a kindred minority population in Macedonia or their kindred majority population in Kosovo, there would be an international outcry.
Yeah.
So why is it that Serbia can do this within these international agreements?
I think for two main reasons. Reason number one is the Serbian state is much stronger than ours. I think that Serbian nation is not stronger than Albanian nation. On the contrary, I think Albanian nation is stronger than Serbian nation. But Serbian state is stronger than Kosovo, stronger than state of Albania, stronger than our two states combined together. And the second reason why we are having this situation is the links between Belgrade and Moscow. I think many in EU are frightened that Serbia dragged France in World War I into war, and next time it will drag Russia. So I think they are appalled. But what to do with this fear, Janos? You know, it's like if you're afraid, you cannot be a solution. So fear is never a solution. Perhaps you should prepare well. I'm not asking now to jump into some kind of ultimate conclusion or into urgent action. But however, fear as such is not a solution. So I'm afraid of the fear of Europeans when it comes to Serbia, because they see it as a proxy of Russian Federation. So let's please Belgrade so we don't have to deal with Moscow. And meanwhile, it is Putin who is financing all these neo-fascists across Europe uninterruptedly and without any proper stoppage and combat as it should be from EU.
Let's go back to the Serbian minority question here. These 33 agreements between Kosovo and Serbia that have been, let's say, signed under EU auspices, you want to revisit these in some way, to try and figure out their practical value, I presume?
Yes, not with the idea to get obsessed with the past, but to move forward by learning some lessons and driving safely. So, when you're about to start your car and you start engine, you do two things. You look at rear view mirror, what is behind you, and you check what kind of road it is.
You check how much gas you have.
Yes, true. And so I just want to do these two elements before starting the engine, which will be first month in office, not more. Evaluation of these agreements, the impact and the reality of the citizens, and also the extent of their implementation. First week in office, starting the dialogue with Serbs of Kosovo. I look forward to meet with Mr. Borrell. I have no illusions it will not be an easy meeting, but...
You're not going to ask for Spanish recognition, are you?
No. But I think that he is aware that dialogue must be prepared well, which needs dialogue with Serbia, dialogue with Brussels, prior to dialogue with Serbia. So we need this preparatory phase. And then I can envisage that before elections in Serbia, we might start dialogue with Belgrade, with Serbia. But I don't think that we could get to any kind of quick fix before spring next year. I will inherit an open wound, which was done by two presidents of Kosovo and Serbia. So I propose, like, let's say, 3 principles. How are we going to close this open wound? Principle number 1, no deal without dialogue. So they used to focus on fiesta after the deal instead of in dialogue before the agreement. Principle number 2, no dialogue with maps. Because unfortunately, 2 presidents were thinking that they are Tudjman and Milosevic over map of Bosnia with not that sharp pens in their hands. So that time has passed. Therefore, dialogue about the rights of the citizens, needs of the communities, not dialogue with maps. And third principle, taking into consideration that maps will continue to exist, no presidents around maps. Only experts on demarcation, but no presidents who think that they are army generals in World War I. So these two principles, I think, will heal this wound that they have opened.
Follow up to this, what is your view of the appointment of two special envoys? I mean, one, Matt Palmer, was already there in a way, but the appointment in particular of Ambassador Grinnell, specifically to focus on the talks between Kosovo and Serbia, what is your view of that?
I read carefully the letter that was sent by President Trump in December last year. There are two interesting expressions. One of them worries me a bit. The other one is quite hopeful. The one which worries me is peace talks. We haven't talked about peace talks since Rambouillet. So in Vienna, in Brussels, these are not peace talks, because peace talks are done during times of conflict, of war. So we call them normalization talks. I don't see any conflict around. So peace talks worried me. But one other expression, which is very, very hopeful, is unified voice. President Trump asked Kosovar people and politicians to speak with a unified voice. And I look forward to create a negotiation team together with opposition and civil society on two levels, political representational and the other level, technical professional. So I want to bring everybody together because Serbia should not become a wedge in the Kosovar political scene. Paradoxically, Serbia was always asset of Albanian unification, and I think we should not lose this asset by turning Serbia into a wedge which divides us and separates us and creates animosity in Kosovar political scene. We have two envoys. I think that their stance was quite clear, that more or less they don't have red lines regarding topics that will be discussed, but this not necessarily means that the final agreement will be acceptable by US. Well, in the Balkans, you cannot have an agreement without US. So you must be crazy if you think that there will be an agreement and US will not endorse and accept it. Therefore, if we do not know whether final agreement with Serbia is going to be accepted by US, we should be careful. So this should turn us into cautious politicians, not into those who will jump for quick fixes. And I recognize that, I acknowledge that it will improve the images of our two countries, agreement between Kosovo and Serbia. But this agreement between Kosovo and Serbia has to be a sustainable one. We cannot afford another failure. Some of the conflicts in human history were not caused by lack of agreements, but by bad agreements. So I think we should be careful, prepare dialogue well. Once we have agreement, of course, investments might come, our image will be better. But I must say that for normalization of relations with Serbia, we need normal Serbia, normal Kosovo, especially normal Serbia, which has to face its own past, because I think they are doing everything just in order not to look at themselves in the mirror. So they are looking at everybody else just in order not to take responsibility for what has happened in Kosovo, whereas the same political clique of the 90s is still in power in Belgrade.
Interesting what you say, because the message, particularly from the White House, has been that we want to move this as quickly as possible. What you're saying is this has to be very carefully prepared to make sure it's a good agreement.
Yes.
Agreement in and of itself isn't the question. It's a question of whether it will hold, whether
Yes.
it's implementable, whether it will be accepted for many generations.
Yeah. I think that faster we reach agreement, better will be. But I wouldn't put deadlines, time frames as priority and push down the content, the substance of agreement and the procedure of dialogue. This is.
And it's not actually the best time to push an agreement. You're still in the process of forming a government in Kosovo.
Exactly.
Serbia faces elections in the spring. The European Union faces its own internal elections and changes in the Commission presidency and so forth. The whole Brexit question is preoccupying Europe. It's not the most fortuitous time to push for an agreement here.
I couldn't agree more. I think we have to be careful because now are times when you can make big mistakes. And we need to strengthen internally the state of Kosovo in two dimensions. First, into national consensus regarding relations with Serbia. And second, into fighting corruption and bringing back hope to people, especially to youth and women, for some perspective with jobs and well-being in our country. So these two dimensions are both very important when it comes to future dialogue. But if I would have to foresee a certain agreement which would be quite soon achieved with Serbia, that would be a kind of a peace declaration. And I think it's necessary. If Kosovo and Serbia would have a peace declaration that we are going to respect each other, that we all want to join in EU, that we will include our states and people into regional and European integration, that we will cooperate with Brussels and Washington and New York, that we are not going to attack each other, neither militarily or in any other ways. I think between Kosovo and Serbia, instead of a quick fix that we would call final agreement or historical reconciliation or comprehensive solution or whatever, we can have a peace declaration.
You're talking about sort of confidence building, basically, between the two sides.
Some peace declaration, because you need peace to have other things. So if President Trump said peace talks, and he did, he used this expression, then we can have a peace declaration.
You presumably you'll be suggesting that to Ambassador Grenell. One of the things that it sort of dropped off the let's say the main talking points at the moment. There's still, it's lingering still, this question of border adjustments or land swaps. You've been very adamant that this is not a good idea. How would you explain that to him, that the dangers that could come from this, let's say, territorial question?
This was done like within a frame of a dozen of secret talks between two presidents, with mediation or without. And you cannot achieve peaceful agreement, let alone sustainable one, as long as you engage in these land swap ideas. I must say that those who engaged in these are actually the same who tried to cause incidents on the ground, but they didn't really function. From, let's say, Serbo-Russian train, which tried to enter Kosovo, to spectacular arrest of Marko Đurić, who was released immediately without a fine. Because, you know, if he violated law in our constitution, he did, he should be brought to court. He was released from police station. It's not okay. So I think that there has been a few short, bad movies by co-production between Belgrade and Pristina in these recent years, which, as if they tried to cause some incidents on the ground in order to make more reasonable land swap, territorial exchange. But in 21st century, in last years of second decade of 21st century, there is no more fuel for their war machinery. You don't have people who are ready to die for presidents like 30 years ago or 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I think there has been some miscalculation on their side. And land swap idea, which is being called by President Thaci, is called border adjustment with painful compromise. By President Vučić is called razgraničenje, delimitation, which is a racist concept. What do you mean delimitation? Like when you hear the word razgraničenje in Serbian language, the imaginary that
ethnic
comes,
division.
Yeah, it's division and it's a fence. It's a barbed wire. Razgraničenje is a barbed wire. So
separation.
Yeah, it's like you always will have Serbs and Albanians in both sides of the border. And for me, it is very strange how certain people could even write and publish a concept called peaceful ethnic cleansing. You know, and I think we really should move away from that. This has been a trap of President Vučić, which was comprised of, I did a lot of maths in gymnasium and in university, 2 axioms. Axiom number 1, Janusz, was as follows. He said, to paraphrase him, show me what do you offer and I can discuss about everything. Meaning your imagination is your limit. Pretending he's offering a concession when actually he's asking for one. So show me what do you offer. Of course, alluding to North, and I'm ready to discuss about everything, alluding to national unification, while actually committing nothing, Serbia, to this. Second axiom is even more cunning. 2 negations which do not create one affirmation. He did not say that I recognize independence of Kosovo, but he said, I cannot recognize independence at these present borders. Which means, you change your borders, I might change my mind. But he did not say that he's going to change his mind. But he wants you first to act. And this is like in chess, Zugzwang, you know, the one who is about to play is doomed to fail. So the one who plays first will lose. And this is the set that he was trying to create, and I'm afraid that in this set, which was a political and geopolitical trap, quite some Albanian politicians and international diplomats fell into.
It's not even a quid pro quo, it's quid for more quid.
Exactly.
Just 2 more questions, because I see our time is running out. What do you think the impact would be on Kosovo of the EU decision not to start accession talks with Albania and North Macedonia? I presume it will have also an impact on Serbia.
I think that EU, but particularly France, President Macron thinks that you need internal reform before any kind of external expansion. I'm among those who think that these things go hand in hand. I really believe that EU should reform itself, but not at the expense of expansion. Because Mr. Juncker tried it, and once he said there will be no enlargement during my mandate, you got Brexit. So EU is a very serious thing. There is no status quo. If you do not progress, you regress. And it's a very unfortunate decision for Albania and North Macedonia. But I think it's not only unfortunate for these 2 countries, but for EU itself. Because EU is undergoing a certain crisis, which I must say is not as much socioeconomic as crisis of vision and ideas. It looks as if we are lacking progressive intellectuals, politicians, philosophers who would come together and have a dream for 21st century and EU in it. And this is worrying us all. EU and the Western Balkans are very important for each other. Not only EU for Western Balkans, but likewise vice versa. So perhaps in a couple of decades, historians will write that in First World War, in 20th century, there were no 2 world wars, but only one with 2 episodes. And it all started in Sarajevo. And if we want to preserve history as knowledge and ideals as vision in politics, EU should include sooner rather than later all 6 countries of Western Balkans. And again, we are in a bad situation, but EU is not saving itself, but by keeping us away from them.
Final question, Albin. Vetevendosja's victory has, I think rightly so, generated a lot of enthusiasm and optimism in Kosovo society. I see this sort of talking to people in the past few days. But is there a danger that public expectations may be raised too high and too early? After all, being in government is a lot more complicated and tasking than being in the opposition. In order for you to deliver on these election pledges but not disappoint people, I mean, there's the sort of time pressure in some respects. How would you address that?
It is true that people have high expectations. Mm-hmm. It is true that people voted for change, and they showed that no big money can buy them. They showed that citizen of our republic is not for sale. And I really profoundly respect and love that. I'm not going to be a prime minister who is going to manage expectations. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be a prime minister who is going to fulfill promises. People have high expectations, so be it.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much, Albin. And once you're in office, love to have you back again to talk about other questions that we haven't yet discussed. But thank you again for being with me on the show.
Thank you, Janusz. This is new hour for Kosovo now, not only new Bugajski hour.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and my colleagues here at RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshim.